You know, here at the Dover Church, we have this little catchphrase, God loves you and there's nothing you can do about it. We say it all the time, God loves us and there's nothing you can do about it. And we can do about it. And I believe that it's not just a catchy phrase, but it's an article of faith. That we believe that God loves everyone. Absolutely everyone. From the sweetest little child and the nicest old nun to everyone in between. And then there are also the people who could care less whether God loves them or not. And then there are the really horrible people in the world who probably only their mother loves. And yet, we agree with the first few groups, the little kids and the nuns and us. And then we get a little more iffy about the further away from lovable we get. But we have to understand what we mean when we talk about God's love. Because it's not necessarily this image of God and each of us walking through the garden, holding hands and skipping and singing and looking soulful into each other's eyes. Although that can be the case for some of us or all of us from time to time. But you need to think of it this way, that God's love is this unceasing energy drawing everyone inward to a circle, if you will. Drawing us towards love like being embraced or holding hands, or here in New England, at least waving from across the church. And setting us free from anything and everything but love. And we believe that God loves everyone and everything all the time, no conditions, no exceptions. Can I get an amen on that? Amen. Or at least, oh, okay, sounds good. Now, that's true, but God prefers the poor. And I know you're thinking, well, you just changed the whole equation. What kind of love is that if it's for everyone, but there's a subgroup that God prefers? Well, let me begin here. One of the chief differences between paganism and biblical religion is that pagan gods prefer the rich and the beautiful and the best athlete and the best warrior and the wisest and the best poet. Paganism is about everyone looking up towards the top. How many of you have been to Greece or Rome? You've been there? Or at least you saw the pictures in school. How many of you saw any statues of an ordinary Sophocles or an ordinary Cicero with a pot belly and a not so pretty face or a big hips or anything, right? No, they're all ideal types. That's what paganism is all about. But the biblical witness to the Lord our God is very clear from beginning to end. God has a special place in God's heart for the poor. And that is, after all, most of humanity. For most of the human experience on this earth, and at the time of Jesus, it was 99.9999999% of humanity were the poor. It was just the emperor in Rome who was rich. And then when capitalism emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries and onward, these things called the middle class and the non-noble wealthy, which is where we fit in, emerged. And we are only the 1% or the 5% or the 10%. And I say we because if we live here, we're not poor. But that still leaves 90, 95, 99% who are poor. And God's attention always starts at the bottom of the barrel. If you read the stories, God comes down to free the slaves in Egypt. I mean, misery, making mud bricks. That's where God goes. Or Jesus shows up as a peasant in Galilee. And what does he do? He washes people's feet. He walks around begging for food. He's about being with and lending a hand. Now, in many Christian traditions, where this sermon would go would be about overthrowing the world order and class warfare and despoiling the rich. But as I was thinking about it, Jesus himself said, "You will always have the poor with you." So I think that's something we have to keep in mind, that as human beings, we are part of the nature of the biological order, in that some people thrive more robustly than others. So why does God prefer the poor? Well, first, for the good of all humanity, as in the social good. And second, for the good of all creation. And I know this sounds like a trite cliche now, because we've heard it so many times, but we are all woven, and not just us, but the birds and the trees and the fish and everyone everywhere are woven together in a web of mutual interdependence. And ultimately, and science is teaching us this now in a way that our ancestors didn't know, we either all thrive together or the fabric is torn apart. Torn apart by war, torn apart by slavery and exploitation, torn apart by environmental degradation. And so the first big difference between us and the poor is the poor know this, because they can't escape. If you saw in the news this week, the floods in southern Africa, those people weren't warned and they had nowhere to go. Or the people out in Nebraska and Iowa, they were warned, but they had no place to go. Or if cholera or Ebola comes to a village in the Congo or Haiti, everyone dies because they can't shelter themselves from it. Whereas we are able to buffer ourselves and protect ourselves. And just so you understand, there's no judgment statement. I'm not saying good, bad, evil, righteous on any of this. I'm just pointing out some differences. We're going to get to the point of the sermon in a moment. But our lives are about sheltering and buffering ourselves and protecting ourselves from all of that stuff. Like when you talk about climate change, everyone says, well, I'm just going to build a better house a little higher up from the water with better air conditioning and I'll be okay. Or if the world becomes scarce with things to eat, well, I make enough money, I can afford to pay higher prices. Or if there are wars that break out in the rest of the world because of scarce resources, well, my government and my army will protect me. Now, we are human beings, so we suffer too. We're mortal, right? So we have aches and pains. We lose loved ones, and ultimately all of us are going to die, and so we live with that. And we're relational, like our circle here. So we go through life and we experience rejection. We experience betrayal. We experience failure. But where we differ from the rest of humanity is we suffer from self-absorption. The spiritual challenge of self-absorption. Where when you're wealthy, it's so easy to go through life thinking everything's about me, about my ego. And I'll just give some examples. Where we're going around and we say, I'm so busy with everything I've got to do, I don't have time to enjoy myself right now. Or everything's so expensive, I have to work harder and harder and harder. Or, I've got big dreams, big ambitions, so I've got to stay at the office longer. Or, I like my things just so, like my car has to be 73 degrees with the seat this high up and just so, and my house in this way, and my food in this way, and my bed only with sheets that are 440 deniers. I can't enjoy myself. Or I go over to someone else's house in the neighborhood and I'm like, oh my God, look at that TV, I've got to have one. Or look at that car. Or look at anything. And the truth is, my friends, all of us here live as well, if not better, than kings and queens in the Middle Ages. And yet, the number of people in our way of life who suffer from addictions of one kind or another, whether it's our cell phones or our iPads or drugs and alcohol or something else is staggering. And we suffer also because of isolation. Work long hours, tight schedules. We don't have time, like Jesus and his pals, to hang around the village well and just chat. Or if you go over to Ireland and hang out in the pub and just chat. We've got to go to work. We've got to get home. We've got to get the kids to baseball. Now, I know I'm generalizing. And I don't mean to offend. I'm just talking about my life. Maybe your life's different. But I don't think I'm wrong. You know, we joke, we call these things first world problems because people in Haiti don't have the luxury of having these problems. And many of us, I believe, are like the rich man in the parable, but not after death, during our lives. We suffer. As Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist preacher, talks about, we have all the conditions for happiness, and yet we suffer. Are we doomed as wealthy people? Obviously not, because God loves everyone, right? And actually, in the story where he says Moses and the prophets, they have Moses and the prophets. We have Moses and the prophets and Jesus too. And they give us the solution to the suffering that we experience. And it's quite simple. Go to the poor. Go to the suffering. Go to the lonely and the heartbroken and the sick. Get down on your knees and care for them. I know many of you have done this sort of thing. Any of you who've served in a soup kitchen or been a nurse or been a teacher of small children or done any of the things where you are caring for someone else, caring for an elderly relative. When you're doing those things, your mind is completely clear of whatever it was that was bugging you when you went in there. Like, boy, this iPhone 6S really stinks compared to the 10. I got to get a better one. Or, you know, I don't know, this car just does not do what it used to do. Or anything else. And the kids who go with me to Maine, and before that to West Virginia, always will say, why are these people so happy? They're much happier than I am. And what it does is it relativizes all the things that seem less than perfect in our lives. And also, this has been my experience, is when I'm with someone in Haiti or over at the VA hospital where some guy's not going to get better or someplace else, I find myself being elevated by their heroism in the face of struggles that I think would break my heart. Now, we heard the story of Cain and Abel, right? Am I my brother's keeper? And that's an extreme example, right? He killed his brother over jealousy, over who had the better gift. But God would say, absolutely. Absolutely. You are your brothers and your sisters' keepers as they are your keepers. For their good. Because no matter where you are or how bad you think your life is, there's someone who is worse off than you. And in going to that person, you will be set free from everything that bothers you about your life. And that truly is good news. Amen.